IB Bio, Ecology and Conservation, Option C, Part 1, picks up where Ecology Core left off. The Ecology option develops concepts introduced in the Core and brings in many new concepts. This movie will have its focus on competition for resources among different populations, different species. The essential idea is community structure is an emergent property of an ecosystem. Here is the outline for all of IB Bio, Ecology, Option C movies. Use this outline to find the part you need. This movie has its focus right here. I've defined ecology here as the study of the interactions among organisms and their environment. The interactions among organisms can be biotic, and the interaction among organisms and their non-living environment. An ecosystem is a community of different species interacting with one another and with the chemical and physical, the abiotic factors, making up its non-living environment. Here's an IB syllabus statement. The distribution of species is affected by limiting factors. Keep in mind that a biome are regions of the earth inhabited by certain types of life, especially vegetation, a collection of ecosystems sharing similar climatic conditions. The climatic conditions determine the location of a biome, but most importantly, rainfall and temperature influence the presence or absence of species in a location. Rainfall and temperature would be limiting factors. Rainforest biomes are located near to the equator due to high rainfall and warm temperatures found at the equator. The tundra biome is located near to the poles due to low rainfall, cold temperatures, and low light conditions. Consider the limiting factors that influence the distribution of the tundra biome on the planet. Temperature and precipitation are the most important abiotic limiting factors. You can see in this diagram that rainforests are located near to the equator, while the world's great deserts are located 30 degrees north or south of the equator. Tundra biomes are located near to the poles. A warm, wet climate supports the rainforest. Moving north or south from the equator with decreasing temperatures, there are temperate forests, boreal forests, then tundra. With decreasing precipitation at any temperature, deserts are the result. Consider the limiting factors here of rainfall and temperature. Mountains affect local climate. Increasing altitude above sea level results in a decrease in temperature. And air with water vapor rising over a mountain will result in rainfall on the windward side of the mountain and dry conditions on the leeward side of the mountain. Now let's move to some definitions. A population is a group of individuals of the same species which live in a defined region close enough to be interbreeding. Here's a population of killer whales, or Sinus orca, in the open ocean biome, and a population of African elephants in the savanna biome. The savanna is the habitat, the environment, in which the African elephant normally lives. Community is defined as populations of all species living and interacting in a defined area, a common habitat. In this photograph, you can see different species interacting in a common habitat. We have producers, we have primary consumers, we have secondary consumers, we have scavengers, and don't forget the decomposers in the soil. This is a community. A community, populations of all species living and interacting in a defined area, a common habitat. Here's the relevant IB syllabus statement. Describe local examples to illustrate the range of ways in which species can interact within a community. The range of ways in which species interact within a community are outlined here. The interactions include competition within a population or among closely related species. Interactions include predator-prey relationships, animal consuming animal, and a similar idea of animal consuming plant called herbivory. We have symbioses, such as mutualism, which is a relationship where both species benefit from the relationship, ++. We have parasitism, also a symbiosis, where one species benefits while the other is harmed. And we have commensalism, where one species benefits while the other species neither benefits or is harmed. And lastly, we have keystone species whose presence in the ecosystem increases diversity, whose presence stabilizes the ecosystem. Now, the rest of this movie will focus on competition, and part 2 will tackle the other interactions. In order to understand competition, I will need to introduce you to the term and concept of the niche. Stay tuned. In this photograph, there are two individuals of the same species competing for resources. In this case, two males competing for females with which to mate. This is intra-specific competition, as the two individuals are of the same species. Now, competition is defined as a common demand by two or more organisms upon a limited supply of resource. For example, limited food, water, light, space, mates, nesting sites. Competition may be intra-specific among individuals of the same species or interspecific among individuals of different species, though usually the different species would be closely related. Here again is a photograph of intra-specific competition. Competition within a species for food, territory, nest sites, mates, or possibly competition to escape predators. Competition in a community involves all species, even producers. What do producers compete for? Of course, producers compete for light, soil nutrients, and water. In this photograph of a rainforest, we probably have both intraspecific competition and interspecific competition. Competition for light, soil nutrients, and soil water. These gulls would experience intraspecific competition for nest sites on a cliff face. Competition for nest sites, not for the football. Here we can see intraspecific competition between two male hippos competing for females with which to mate. Competition is most intense when resources are limited or in short supply. Competition is defined as a common demand by two or more organisms upon a limited supply of resource. The zebras compete with each other for food, but only if the food supply is limited, which it is not in this image. In this season, there is enough for all of the zebra in the population such that intraspecific competition is not very intense. Now, interspecific competition is competition between two different species, like the wolf and the coyote. But if there's going to be interspecific competition, the two species must be closely related. Why? Because in order to compete, their role in the food chain would have to be very, very similar. And because their roles as consumers are very, very similar, this brings us to the term niche. So here is a definition of the term niche. It is the role of a species in an ecosystem, including all the physical, chemical, and biological conditions needed to live and reproduce. Niche is the job of the organism in the ecosystem, not the address. The address is the habitat. Now, never write this on an IB exam, but use this to understand that niche is about the role, not the habitat. Now, I ask, are the coyote and the wolf occupying the same niche? How about a lion and a hyena? We'll be answering these questions in the slides to follow. But first, here are important IB syllabus statements. Each species plays a unique role within a community because of the unique combination of its spatial habitat and interactions with other species. Interactions between species in a community can be classified according to their effect. In this image, we see hyena and lion apparently in competition over a kill, but hyenas and lions do not occupy the same niche. Thus, these two species are not in direct competition. The lion and hyena have different roles in the ecosystem. Lions are predatory carnivores. Lions are in the cat family. They hunt and kill prey. Hyenas are in the dog family and tend to be more scavenger. They feed on what's left over after lions have killed. Now, I suppose if many hyenas were to gang up on a lion after a fresh kill, there could be a brief moment of competition, but generally, these two species each occupies a different niche. So it makes sense that the lion and the hyena are not direct competitors, as they are not so closely related. The hyena is in the dog family and the lion is in the cat family. But what about these two species, both cats? And their role is quite similar as predators on the East African plain. So I ask the questions: can two different but closely related species be in direct competition over an extended period of time for the same resources? Or in other words, can two species occupy the same niche over an extended period of time, over evolutionary time? So before I address the question being, can two different but closely related species occupy the same niche over an extended period of time, we must look more carefully at the term niche. I want you to think of niche as the way in which the species gains resources optimally. The role of a species is defined by optimal resource gathering. Now this graph shows resource use across niche dimension, spatial dimension, in which the species experiences the chemical, physical, and biological factors of the ecosystem. And at this point in the ecosystem, the species gains resources optimally. With respect to Z resource, its niche in the ecosystem is here. This organism gains its resource optimally at this point in the spatial dimension of the niche. Now remember, niche is best thought of as resource use in the ecosystem, the role of the species in the ecosystem, not its habitat. In an ecosystem, a species is successful in its niche if it's gathering resources at an optimal level. But when the environment changes across space, the species is put under pressure. As we look at this curve, we can see resource use across some environmental gradient. At this point in the ecosystem, the biological and physical factors are optimal for high resource use. But the species would be put under stress if resources were less available. And the species would be put under stress if one abiotic variable or more would be in excess. The species would struggle and might be absent altogether. Now remember, a niche describes the particular set of abiotic and biotic conditions and resources to which an organism or a population responds. So you must think clearly and broadly when considering the role of a species in ecosystems. It's easy to imagine the role of a predator or the role of a primary consumer, but what about the niche of plants? In this image, we have a niche defined by abiotic factors, a specific temperature, and pH. Here is a niche defined by three abiotic variables: temperature, pH, and humidity. At the edges of the spatial habitat or in a changing environment, the abiotic or biotic conditions to which a species responds may not be optimal. These conditions would put pressure on the species. The species may struggle, numbers may be low, or natural selection might force adaptations in the population to be better suited to the environment as it is. The curve we see here displays a range of tolerance. High tolerance for the factors that allow the species to gain resources optimally, and low tolerance where the biotic or abiotic factors inhibit the success of the species. On the left, I've tried to draw a niche of three dimensions, displaying optimal biotic and abiotic conditions that allow optimal resource gathering. On the right, I've drawn the three-dimensional niche of two species, the red and the green, and the two niches overlap, indicating competition for resources, interspecific competition. So I've come back to this question: can two different species, closely related, occupy the same niche? In this diagram, the niche of species red completely overlaps with the niche of species green, thus direct and intense competition. Can two species occupy the same niche as would be implied by species red and species green? As a note, the niches of species red and green overlap partially with that of blue. Competition between either red or green species with blue would simply be less. So, can two different species, closely related species, occupy the same niche? Now, we're going to look at the evidence. Follow closely because you need to be able to analyze a data set that illustrates the distinction between the fundamental and realized niche. The first piece of evidence addressing the question, can two different species occupy the same niche, comes from an experiment in the 1970s by Joseph Connell, who studied two species of barnacle. Connell noticed that Thymallus occupied the upper, drier regions of a tidal coastline, while Balanus occupied the lower, wetter regions of the tidal coastline. Connell conducted two experiments. First, he selected an area and excluded Balanus. In other words, Connell removed Balanus, he excluded Balanus. Secondly, Connell selected an area and removed Thymallus. He excluded Thymallus. Now, in the first experiment, the Thymallus population expanded, ultimately occupying lower and upper reaches of the tidal region. Connell concluded that Thymallus was limited by Balanus, that in the presence of Balanus, the bigger species, Balanus outcompeted Thymallus. Thymallus was limited by a biotic factor, the larger, more competitive Balanus. In the second experiment, where Thymallus was excluded, the Balanus population did not expand into the drier regions of the tidal coastline. Balanus remained in the same tidal region regardless of the absence of Thymallus. Connell concluded that Balanus was limited by abiotic factors, probably water availability. The two species compete, but their niches do not completely overlap. Over time, the populations have evolved to reduce direct competition. Now you can see here that Connell divided the term niche into two parts, the fundamental niche and the realized niche. Now the fundamental niche of Thymallus was the entire range of the tidal region. The fundamental niche is the full range of conditions and resources in which a species could survive and reproduce. But the realized niche of Thymallus was more restricted due to the presence of Balanus. The realized niche describes the actual conditions and resources in which a species exists due to biotic interactions. Now, the fundamental niche of Balanus is the lower, wetter region of the tidal coastline, and its realized niche is the same, as Thymallus is too small to cause interference. The niche of Balanus is determined by abiotic factors. So here are the definitions for fundamental and realized niche. In case you didn't pick them up as I spoke through them on the earlier slide, I'll let you study this slide on your own. In the second and last example of competitive exclusion, we have two paramecium species. When grown separately, Paramecium caudatum and Paramecium aurelia both display classic S-shaped curves with populations reaching a steady-state equilibrium around carrying capacity. But when grown together, Paramecium caudatum numbers decline after day 4, as Aurelia numbers reach carrying capacity. This is competitive exclusion. Two species cannot occupy the same niche for an extended period of time. So here is the critical IB syllabus statement. Two species cannot survive indefinitely in the same habitat if their niches are identical. I'll let you read the competitive exclusion principle here. In order to survive extreme competition, one of the two species, possibly the less competitive one, might evolve, becoming adapted to new conditions, conditions at the edges of the niche, environmental conditions that initially did not favor the species. But by natural selection, the population's genetics change, becoming better and better adapted to the difficult conditions. Over evolutionary time, the niches of the two species separate, and with enough time, the two species would certainly not occupy the same niche, such that there would be little competition for resource. In the late 1950s, an ecologist named Robert H. MacArthur studied warblers in North American spruce trees. Upon a superficial examination of the ecosystem, MacArthur thought he may have discovered many warbler species occupying the same niche. But with careful study, and detailed quantitative analysis of bird position, MacArthur realized that the 5 species of warblers partitioned the resource, thus reducing competition among the species. Some species spent time feeding in this portion of the tree, while others here, and others here, and so on. So let's come back to the 2 earlier examples of possible competition, the lion and the cheetah, and the coyote and the wolf, and ask the question, what's the thinking here? Do the lion and cheetah occupy the same niche? Do the coyote and wolf occupy the same niche? Now, the lion and cheetah probably do compete for some resources, but it does appear that the cheetah feeds mostly on Thompson's gazelle and feeds during the day, unlike the lion. The wolf and the coyote probably could compete for some resources, but the coyote is more of an opportunist, part scavenger, part predator, and mostly avoiding the territory of the wolf. Competition has the potential to reduce the success of a species in its habitat. Thus, mechanisms to reduce competition, to reduce niche overlap, would benefit species over evolutionary time. Now, reduced competition can occur through specialized feeding habits, changing location within a habitat, or evolving through natural selection to shift the niche. We will study the mechanism of natural selection elsewhere in this course. In returning to this slide that summarizes Connell's conclusions that both abiotic and biotic conditions are important in defining the niche of a species, I want to return to an analysis of the theoretical concept of the range of tolerance or zone of tolerance. The zone of tolerance for Thymallus would be here, while the zone of tolerance for Balanus would be here. The range of tolerance needs to be viewed as a bell-shaped curve where the niche of the species is optimal within these environmental conditions and less than optimal at the extremes of the environmental conditions. Now, this is known as Shelford's law of tolerance, where the species experiences zones of intolerance, zones of stress, and zones that are optimal for its role in the ecosystem. This diagram visually displays the number of fish as a function of an abiotic variable, temperature. These extremes of temperature put the species in zones of stress, while this range of temperature is optimum. This diagram displays a gradient of salt from low salt on the left to high salt on the right. A gradient is a gradual change in an abiotic factor across space. The distribution of various plant species is displayed along this abiotic salt gradient. The presence of different plant species is displayed by these bars. These bars display the limits of tolerance for salt for each species. For example, the perennial ryegrass is not tolerant of high salt, surviving only in the low salt conditions. Medium to high salt would stress the ryegrass species. Sea barley tolerates medium to high salt conditions. Zones of stress for sea barley grass would be conditions of low salt and very high salt. So here's the relevant IB syllabus statement. Describe the distribution of one animal and one plant species to illustrate the limits of tolerance and zones of stress. You could go back one slide and look at the ryegrass or the sea barley to illustrate limits of tolerance and zones of stress. This slide displays the relationship of water temperature, here in the lower image, with the presence of coral species here in the upper image. Together, we can see that corals have a zone of stress that is outside of the tropics. Here is an image of mountain saxifrage that has its niche in high mountain tundra-like conditions. With climate change, will the saxifrage experience stress? Will environmental change occur so quickly that it might not survive? The barnacles provide a further example for you to describe the distribution of an animal species to illustrate limits of tolerance and zones of stress. I've come back to this slide, though, for a different reason. This slide begins a short section that describes how data is collected in an effort to understand the distribution of different populations across space, to understand the optimal zones and zones of stress. The image of the rocky intertidal ecosystem provides a nice example of change in abiotic conditions across space. Wet conditions below the mean water level and dry conditions above the mean water level. A transect line across the ecosystem would allow scientists to measure the change in the abundance of species along the wet to dry gradient. Let's take a closer look at this. Now here you see a transect line with randomly selected plots along a gradient, wet to dry, more humid to less humid, more soil moisture, less soil moisture, from close to the lake, far away from the lake. Now the plots would measure the abundance of different species. The gradient is the change in the abiotic variable, soil moisture, wet to dry. The study examines the impact of the abiotic variable on the biotic variable of species abundance. Here is the relevant IB syllabus statement. Use a transect to correlate the distribution of plant or animal species with an abiotic variable. In this slide, you can see numerous randomly selected quadrats along transect lines that run parallel to the abiotic gradient, wet to dry, high saline soil to low saline soil, or high light to low light. Notice numerous randomly selected plots, more than 10 in each of the 3 zones, allows averages to be calculated. Transect lines allow one to correlate the distribution of plant or animal species with an abiotic variable. In this diagram, we can see an intertidal ecosystem displayed here. High water, wet, low water, dry. Water is the likely abiotic variable of importance that determines the presence, absence, abundance of different species. This is a kite diagram, and we can see the distribution of species along the gradient, and their abundance is represented by the thickness of the bar. Channeled wrack is found in relatively high abundance in dry conditions, high up on the rocky shoreline, but not found at all in the wet conditions, low on the rocky shoreline. Oarweed is found in relatively low abundance in the dry conditions, high up on the rocky shoreline, but found in high abundance in the wet conditions, low on the rocky shoreline. Here is a belt transect along a mountainside examining the changing altitude as the abiotic variable on the distribution of species along the transect line. The abiotic variables important in the abundance of species could be temperature, rainfall, or soil chemistry. Here are different images that display how transect lines with quadrats would be used to correlate the distribution of plant or animal species with an abiotic variable. Here is another image of quadrats being sampled along a transect. The transect would be used to correlate the distribution of plant or animal species with an abiotic variable. Now, except for this last section on the sampling of plant and animal species in an ecosystem, this movie had its focus on competition within a population or among closely related species. In Part 2, we will look at predator-prey, symbioses, and keystone species. And that brings us to the end of IB Biology, Ecology and Conservation, Option C, Part 1.